doing something about climate change is called climate action. And somebody already mentioned these words in the chat at the beginning. So when we talk about climate action, we often make a distinction between mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation is really about reducing the causes of climate change. So the image Sophie showed at the beginning, there are many different causes of climate change, a lot related to burning fossil fuels. And we can try to reduce those causes and then limit the effects of climate change. And the world is working on that. It's a little bit of a sad story as well, especially for the African continent, because Africa emits less than 4% of the global greenhouse gases, but actually is amongst the most vulnerable of the effects. And I think this map shows that really clearly. So on the left, we see how much emissions different countries have. So how much gas they emit to the air. And on the right, we see the climate risk. So across the whole continent, we can actually see that Africa has very little emissions, but has a huge risk. So it's really the responsibility of the whole world to do this mitigation, so to reduce the causes of climate change. The world is trying. Opinions differ about how well we are doing, but one of the biggest things the world has been doing is the Paris Agreement. It's an agreement signed in 2015 by almost every country. And the goal there is to keep the global warming below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5 degrees. It's a little bit doubtful if we will manage that. But because of this agreement, a lot of action has been happening. So countries submit their plans and they promise certain amounts of money that they invest in it. And there's also parts of this that say that the countries that emit the most should invest money on mitigation and adaptation in the countries that have the most risk. So that's a really big thing that's happening. And then personally, I think one of the biggest transitions we have been making is in renewable energy. So the amount of renewable energy that's being produced has grown a lot. So this graph is showing that. So it's from 2000 to 2023, and you really can see that it is much more. The percentage of contribution from Africa is still quite low, but especially in Europe and China, the production has been growing gigantically. But even now in African countries, we see that the renewable energy, so we call it, so energy from the sun, the wind, is taking up. And as we saw, we can choose to not burn fossil fuels. We can also choose to take gases from the air. So one big initiative, for example, is the Great Green Wall Initiative. I don't know if you have heard about it, but it's, again, a kind of fund that really tries to re-green a lot of areas. And there's, I think, 14 billion USD involved in there, so it's quite big. So that's a little bit about mitigation. Then there's adaptation. And there, what I really like about that is that you can do a lot about it on a personal level as well. So it really needs to be in the institutes, but also on a personal level. And adaptation really means preparing for the impacts. So we're actually certain that we cannot stop climate change completely, but now that we know it's happening, what can we do so that we can still have a nice life, basically. And again, there's a lot being done on a policy level. So a lot of countries are making national adaptation plans, we call them. In the Netherlands, there's going to be a big update to this next year, but also in several African countries. They are being started off mainly it's mainly at a government level. But then at a smaller level, also a lot is happening. And when you look at adaptation, you can really see a difference in adaptation reacting to some effects or really preparing for them. And we will go deeper into that in a next session. But for example, like kind of reacting to an effect would be an early warning system. So Ghana is trying to set that up so that you are better prepared if there's a flood or a big drought. You can also say, okay, the waters are rising, for example, or we are actually losing our water. Let's try to find ways to retain this water. So to make sure it's not being lost. Then you can build dams, for example. And then lastly, you can also look at the more from the ecosystem approach. So for example, wetlands are very important actually to keep water and to bring water. And you can try to preserve them because they have been disappearing a lot. So that's a bit more on the still government or community level. But then I think we see a lot of impacts in agriculture. And even on a farm, you can do a lot. And again, you can see that there's more reactive things you can do and more transformative things. For example, there's tools now that show you, for example, this is an example in Kenya on fungicide, but show you the best times to apply this. So it takes into account the changing weather, and then you can do that more times better, which means you have less effects on your crops because of the changing weather. Also, people are changing the crops they are planting, so use crops that are better suitable for the new weather. Or, for example, diversify what they are doing. So there's here an example of agroforestry. So it means you have trees together with your plants that produce the food. And here's an example in cacao. So those are some examples of what you can do in adaptation. And adaptation is actually a really positive story. So I think this climate change is horrible, but it forces us, in my opinion, to change things. And actually, if you look at a world that is well suited for climate change, it's actually a much nicer world than we live in now. And I think we can really look at it from that way. So we don't only have to think about, oh no, we have to prevent damage, horrible things are happening, so to avoid risk, but actually, now that we have to change, how can we change such that it's actually a nicer way? And maybe places become healthier or more sustainable to live in. And it's also, if you then have to convince policymakers to do this, it's actually shown that it adds value. These are a bit more examples from Europe because there's a bit more research about it there. But there they say that actually every euro you invest in adaptation, so adapting the system to climate change, brings 2 to 6 euros in return because of less cost for healthcare, more productivity, and these kind of things. So that's what I wanted to tell you about what we can do for mitigation and adaptation. We might go into more depth about it in the next session. So if that's something that interests you, please comment in the chat.